finally, I think that as someone who spends a fair amount of time thinking about these issues of recruitment, but also better representation, what's the number one thing the bank sector as a whole needs to do if it really wants authentic, meaningful, and sustainable change?
Well, it's difficult to say just one thing. I mean, I think the most important thing is role models, actually. I think a lot of people will say you can't be what you can't see. So I think getting senior leaders in, a very diverse senior leadership is really important. I mean, in order to do that, you've got to obviously build a pipeline. Things that we've done around blind recruitment has been really helpful. We introduced a career returners program recently for people who had been out of the workplace on maternity leave or indeed any other reason, and who were a bit nervous about coming back to work. And we offered them a 6-month contract, because I think most people would be okay with 6 months, sort of try before you buy. That's been fantastic at getting more diversity in. Over 50% of our career returners last year were BAME, over 50% of them. So I think there's a number of initiatives, but I think when we really see the dial moving, it will be when we get a lot of senior BAME leaders, and that's certainly increasing in financial services, but it just needs to go further. So we've done a lot, but there's still a lot more to do.
Joanna Place, thank you very much. I wish we had more time, but I appreciate your input. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Good to meet you.
Good day to everyone joining us for this session of the Bloomberg Equality Summit. I'm really happy to be joined by 3 eminent scholars for our conversation today. We have Kayende Andrews, who's a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University in the UK. Catherine Franke, who is a professor of law at Columbia University. And Glenn Lowry, who is a professor of social sciences and economics at Brown University. So thank you all for joining us today. The title for our discussion is The Black Wealth Gap, Economic Opportunity, Reparations, and the Path to Financial Equity. And we will talk about the Black Wealth Gap and how to address it. But first, I'd like to ask each one of you this question to start us off, which is, does the United States have a moral duty to pay reparations? And there are many kinds of reparations that could be paid, but to pay those as a moral duty, as a recognition that it enslaved an estimated 10 to 12 million Africans in our past. Professor Andrews, let's start with you. You're in the UK, as I mentioned, but you have studied and written extensively about the history of US slavery as well as Britain's colonial past. So what would you say?
Well, I think it's not just a moral issue, it's really a legal issue. The idea and concept in law of reparations is well established. If you look after the Holocaust, the reparations were paid to the Jews who were victims of the Holocaust. If you look in America, there's been some kind of token reparations paid to certain native communities. I mean, if you look at this, is not a moral issue, it's simply a legal one. There was, for hundreds of years, unpaid labor was extracted from enslaved Africans. There was no payment was ever given. People were brought over to the country and then were supposed to celebrate somehow they've been emancipated, but emancipated into conditions of extreme poverty. And the legacy of that is still with us today. I mean, there's a reason why we're having Black Lives Matter protests. And the very reason you have so many Black Americans today is because of slavery. And the wealth from slavery is still very much shaping the US, and the poverty from slavery is still very much shaping the US. So of course there needs to be restitution, but that's not a moral issue, that's simply a legal and perfectly rational one as well.
Professor Franke, what would you say?
Well, I've actually written a whole book on this, Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition. And in that book, I look back at what actually happened to formerly enslaved people as they were emancipated, even before the end of the Civil War. And there were a number of locations in the South, the Sea Islands in South Carolina and outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, where Northern military officials understood that reparations were owed to formerly enslaved people. As a moral matter, at that point, not so much as a legal matter, because the law was not really framing the discussion at that point. And reparations were given. Land was allocated to formerly enslaved people to create free Black communities in those locations. And then that land was stolen from them and returned to their former owners. So not only is it something that we continue to have an obligation to provide today, but it's not a modern radical idea. It was one that white people understood was expected and owed at the time in 1861, 62, 63. So what we did is we freed Black people, but we never really rendered them free. They needed resources to be truly free people, and we're still living with that intergenerational debt. As Martin Luther King said during the Mississippi Poor People's Campaign, they're still waiting for their check.
Professor Lowry, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I'm going to take a contrarian view. I mean, let me start by acknowledging what has been said here, which is that there was a historical crime and people were dispossessed. Those people were due more than what they got. That was 150 years ago. The question before us now is, what do we do with the people who are here now? My concerns for the United States are several. I loathe the idea that we would partition ourselves based upon race into categories of persons whom we would then have the state make transfers based on those categories. That smacks of a South African style essentialization of racial categories. That disturbs me. I worry about the implications for our politics. This is a gift issue to the right wing of the country's political landscape, and they would mine it for decades, mine the resentment and the reaction for decades. We needn't give them that. But most fundamentally, I worry that the obligations to present-day descendants of slaves are obligations, in effect, to all American citizens. And if we were to commodify and discharge the debt with a financial recognition, we would close the door on what should be an open-ended obligation to deal with our citizens fairly.
Yeah, and I've read your writings about that and some of the conversations you had, that you fear that, once reparations are enacted, that somehow then relieves us of an obligation to create a fairer, more equitable society and world. But Dr. Franke, what would you say to that argument that that reparations closes the door to a further discussion about how to create a more equitable world?
Well, we need to have laws that prohibit race discrimination in employment, housing, education, access to everything, as a matter of what it means to live in a just society today. Whether we had a history of slavery or not, every society should have that. What we're specifically talking about is a collective reckoning with one of the founding evils and sins in the United States, which is the institution of slavery that has structured our economy, our political reality, and our culture. We've come to terms with many other past wrongs in this country, but never really fully with slavery. And I think one of the shocking things about it is we're losing ground in dealing with it the longer we wait. Slavery was officially abolished 155 years ago, but it would take the average Black household 288 years to catch up now to the family wealth in similarly situated white households. So the accumulation of time and the accumulation of inequality and what I would call a badge of inferiority that Black people in this country continue to bear has had real economic costs and consequences that we must take account of, because it will only get worse. It won't get better unless we look frankly, and I think in an uncomfortable way, at that history and its consequences.
Professor Andrews, as I mentioned, obviously you're in the UK. Right before our conversation, we had the Chief Operating Officer of the Bank of England, which earlier had apologized for some of its role in slavery. As I understand it, the apology was that they hadn't directly been involved in the slave trade, but they were acknowledging that they had been in some ways a part of it by extending credit, for example. You were critical of that apology earlier. Why was that?
Well, it's this idea that they think there's two real problems with the way we understand slavery and its impact. One is that it was a long time ago, and so therefore it's past. And two, it's only those people who owned slaves or traded in Africans who are culpable. The Bank of England was absolutely directly involved in slavery. Couldn't have happened without the Bank of England, which was the central bank, which kind of underpinned the whole entire banking system, which was necessary for slavery to happen. And I mean, the best example of just how involved, and that ties into this reparations debate, is when for Britain to abolish slavery, it had to make the largest payment the government has ever made in reparations payments to the slave owners. It was 40% of government income at the time, 5% of GDP, approximately 100 billion pounds in today's money. And they had to take a loan, which was so big that they only paid back the loan in 2015, which means that myself and my grandmother, who were descended from the enslaved, have actually been paying back reparations payments to slave owners. And who did they take this loan from? The Bank of England. So for the Bank of England to turn around and say, "Oh, we were not really involved," it just shows how terrible our understanding of this issue is. And the fact that we're still paying this debt off in 2015 should be a reminder that this isn't an issue that's past. You can't talk about the black wealth gap without talking about slavery. That's where it comes from.
Right, and Dr. Franke, you write about this as well in your book, which was issued last year, and which I commend to our audience to read. Reparations were paid, as they were in the UK. They were paid to slave owners, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, the land that was seized in order to provide reparations to Black people was later, the people who had owned that land, the enslavers, the plantation owners, were compensated for the taking of that land after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It was part of a package of repudiation of reparations that President Johnson put in place, where he restored all of the property of the former enslavers. And if they weren't able to take that property back, they were paid for it. Around the same time, the U.S. West was opened up for settlement and homesteads for white people. So free land was being given away to white people to settle the United States, the western part of the United States, with financing and support from the United States government at the very same time that land was being stolen from Black people who had recently been enslaved, and they were forced then to enter into labor contracts with their former enslavers. That's what it meant to be freed, but not really free. And what it meant also was locking Black people, formerly enslaved people, into a permanent intergenerational status of second-class citizenship and peasantry, really. And that's what Professor Dr. Andrews was describing as this intergenerational legacy of a two-tiered society where white people enjoy a different kind of freedom than Black people do. And we can trace that in the United States directly back to the ways in which we failed as a society to fully eradicate the institution of slavery by providing reparations and a real material possibility for Black people to be free at the end of the Civil War.
So, Professor Lowry, as a professor of economics who has looked at these issues and obviously others around economic equality, how do you account for the Black wealth gap that exists, which is profound and has been persistent, obviously?
Yeah, it's partly the result of history, to be sure. People pass assets down across generations within families. But it's also partly a result of the failure of our society to fully develop the human potential of the people who are living today and who lived most recently. That is to say, wealth is not simply a thing that's there. It's something that gets created. It doesn't fall from the sky. It's the consequence of human agency. So I look to the long history of Jim Crow segregation, of the inadequate social provision, education, of blocked opportunity discrimination in labor markets and capital markets, of racism in the commercial sector of the society over the many decades since slavery as another factor helping to contribute to the wealth gap. May I say something else?
Yes.
I mean, I'll say it very briefly. When we talk about Black people and white people, we are engaging in an aggregation of a vastly heterogeneous set of populations. White people are not just white. They are Irish and Italian and Polish and Slavic. They are the descendants of workers who were exploited as well as of landowners who exploited. Black people are not simply Black. We are the product of wave after wave of immigration from non-European sources, from Africa and from the Caribbean. Some Black people are of mixed race ancestry and all the rest. When we try to take on this project of going back and correcting history's wrongs, we essentialize these categories in ways that are unhealthy for the future of our democratic republic. I speak now of the United States of America. There are just Americans here. There shouldn't be Black Americans and white Americans cutting deals with one another across a bargaining table.
So
Professor Andrews, you disagree?
Yes, go ahead.
Because no, that's a really nice. That sounds like poetry, right? We'd all like to think that. But the reality is, both America and the UK and the West more generally, is built on the idea of these racialized concepts. And whether you like to think that there are not Black Americans, there are Black Americans. If you're a Black American, you are far more likely to have less wealth. You're far more likely to be stopped and shot by the police. You're far more likely to live in inner city, crowded neighborhood. There is a reality to this, whether we would like to believe it or not. And that reality is shaped heavily by the history of slavery. This is not something that has gone. That category of the Negro, of the Black, whose life doesn't matter. That's what Black Lives Matter is about. Is still with us. So whether we like to dream is not the case. It is the case. And if you want to actually have any restitution for any of those issues, you have to have talking about wealth. I mean, the estimates are between 4.9 and $15 trillion is owed to African Americans. If you imagine, and if you want to solve the issues of housing inequality, education, etc., you're going to need that money because we live in a capitalist society. So we can dream as much as we like about no Black America, white America, but the reality is we see again and again and again is that's just not the case.
Professor Franke, that's a huge number that Professor Andrews just posited, and you wrote about this as well. For people today, who think, well, my family was not involved in the slave trade, or that was so long ago, how do we wrap our heads around this? You have some ideas that you put forth in your book about how we could approach a collective repair of the past. Give us some examples.
I do, and as I travel around the country talking about this issue, so often I get well-meaning white people saying, look, my parents, my family, my grandparents came to the United States well after the institution of slavery was over. What kind of responsibility do I have for this? And what I would say is that this country remains structured around a kind of power, a kind of ideology of white supremacy that burdens all Black people, as complicated as that category is, as Dr. Lowry notes, but burdens all Black people with a badge of inferiority and endows white people with a kind of privilege and a wind at our back that we didn't earn. And I would say, of course, that Black people didn't earn this badge of inferiority. An interesting thing to note is that Dr. Lowry and I grew up in the same town. He could have been my elder brother. He grew up on the south side of Chicago. I was born on the north side of Chicago, in fact, right at the border of Evanston. He talks about how he and his friends were stopped on the Dan Ryan Expressway by the cops with some frequency. My family didn't have a lot of money when I was younger, but little by little took nest eggs and were able to move us up to the northern wealthy suburbs in a way that I'm sure his family never could have. My family wasn't special. We were white. We had access to white privilege that was part of the American dream that Black people have never had access to in the same way, systematically. And that's why I think we as white people have to take some kind of account for, reckon with, and be willing to surrender the kind of endowments that we have by virtue of our whiteness as a collective matter, whether we have a genetic relationship to the actual enslavement of Black people or not. So it's about understanding this intergenerational transfer, not just of wealth, but of privilege and advantage that I am an inadvertent and lucky beneficiary of, that I feel I have a moral obligation to take some responsibility for.
Professor Lowry, what do you say to that?
I say I understand the psychology of it, but I do worry about the politics and the morality of it going forward. Looking backward is one thing, going forward is another. On the politics front, I repeat, you want to empower the reactionary right wing with a club that they will beat us with for decades? Instantiate a multi-trillion-dollar transfer program to tens of millions of people based upon their racial identity. You think you've seen white privilege and white supremacy in the past? It's going to be nothing like the reaction that you'll get if you go down that road. I think it's very bad for the country. The other thing I would say, and forgive me, I actually, as an African American, I agree with what Dr. Frankie said. I agree that it's in fact the case that my upbringing was less than what it might have been if we had had the opportunity to move out to Evanston or Rogers Park or whatever it might be from the Southside ghetto. I agree with that. Nothing can be done about that. Okay, we can't go back and do that over again. For African Americans to think of ourselves primarily in terms of the fact of our historical victimization is a burden, not an advantage. It inhibits us from realizing our full human potential. It leads us to look to white people to deliver us from the conditions of history. I don't want to rely upon that. I want to rely upon, at the end of the day, my own agency. That's not a pull yourself up by the bootstraps speech. It's a claim to the dignity that comes from being in command of your own life and not having to look to others to deliver you.
Well,
if I can respond to that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Frankie.
Mark, just very quickly. Part of what my project, my intellectual and academic project, but also my political project, is to talk to white people. Not to say to black people, it's okay if you make a demand for reparations, but to speak to white people and say, you have a responsibility to disgorge the wages of whiteness. And so part of what I recommend is that we think about an estate tax, increasing the estate tax, so that the intergenerational wealth and advantage that is passing right now in the largest intergenerational wealth transfer we've ever seen in this planet, from my parents' generation to my generation, can be partly recaptured, recouped through an increased estate tax to put into a trust. I don't recommend writing individual checks to black people. And there's some people who are interested in reparations and have worked on it a long time who do take that position. I think we need to think more collectively than individually. But I think we as white people have to take responsibility for and disgorge, if you will, those advantages of whiteness in order to create a kind of leveling of that intergenerational disadvantage and advantage that is so racially stratified in this country. So my message is to white people that this is work we have to do, not just a demand that black people are making upon us, but a moral demand we should be making on ourselves.
Professor Andrews, how do you think of reparations? How would that work? What would your ideas be?
Well, I mean, the only real question of reparations is how you do it. I mean, really, look, if we want to solve any of these problems and we accept that African Americans are at least $4.9 trillion behind, and we talk about this as though they're historic. I mean, the mass incarceration, for example, is a relatively new phenomenon. If you look at the wealth gap, you look at the conditions people are living in, is maybe worse in many ways over the last 30 years. So let's not pretend this is something historic. The problem is still with us. So if America, and I'm actually talk about radical revolution most of the time, but if you want to make a more optimistic, can we reform, can African Americans be part of the society, then you have to deal with the fact that they're at least £4.9 trillion behind, and that explains a large part of why there's so many problems in the communities. So you would have to say we have to have a massive transfer of wealth. I would definitely say it's not individual, shouldn't be given out to individuals. It should be done in a way which is collective, which can respond, and which can mean that because we're basically working at this huge deficit. And there's no way you can solve the problems of racism, which we're supposedly all interested in now after the Black Lives Matter movement, without dealing with that issue of money. How else could you possibly solve any of these problems?
Professor Lowry, I want to come back, though, to this question of how do you close this wealth gap, if not through something like a collective action, as described by our other panelists. How would you tackle closing that black wealth gap? What are your answers to that?
Well, I wouldn't want to look at it in terms of race. And I understand we're talking about reparations for slavery here, so this is not going to necessarily go over so well. Look, there are more poor white people than there are poor black people. There are more white people killed by police than are black people killed by police, although at a higher rate. There's a lot wrong, I'm speaking now of the United States, with our social and economic organization. We don't have universal health care for people who need it. There are too many Americans in prison and too many Black Americans in prison. We have guns everywhere. We have a punitive politics. We have too much money in our politics. There's a lot wrong. If we could get housing for people who are not well housed, if we could get health care for people who need it, if we could get educational opportunity as it should be for all of our citizens, we wouldn't be talking about racial gaps. We would be building a better society for everybody. Again, I know how that sounds. It sounds like pie in the sky, but I'm insisting politically it's the only way. You don't get anything done in a democracy without 50% of the population. We need to frame our demands in ways that they can be of lasting political success and appeal to a broad coalition of our citizens. Dividing ourselves into racial groups and then bargaining across the table on that basis is the wrong way to go. I repeat.
I mean, I just sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to directly respond to that. I mean, it just sounds like he was talking about the New Deal. When we had this, right? Social democracy. Let's get more left wing. Let's redistribute resources. And what happened on both sides of the Atlantic? It just went to white people, and still race didn't deal with the issue of racism. That's the pie in the sky idea that if you just change it for everybody, it fixes racism. There is zero evidence that ever happened.
Well, and it avoids the question of the institution of slavery, of our history. If you start only with the present and you say, let's make a more just future based on the baseline of today, you're avoiding, and I worry about this as a country, that we avoid looking at this ugliness of our past, of the degree to which our country was founded on, not just the Constitution, but even before that, back to 1691, 1641, even before that. The importation of enslaved people from Africa. This country would not have been possible without that. And it's just it's a historical horror that we have never really confronted. So if we start with the baseline of today, we avoid that national reckoning in a way that will just continue to live with us as it has for these last 155 years.
In my conversation with you before we started this panel, Dr. Franke, I asked you about something similar to what Professor Lowery has just said, which is the political climate that the United States is in at this moment, and in some ways the UK is somewhat similar. Will it allow for that kind of discussion, that kind of reckoning, or are we past that point at this moment in our history in the United States?
Well, I think the question of reparations was one which even 2 or 3 years ago, most of us thought no one was going to talk about, no presidential candidates were going to talk about. The House of Representatives and the rest of the Congress would not take up a reparations bill. But something happened in the last couple of years that we're talking about this issue seriously. It's not just a fringe issue. It's central to the political platforms of every Democrat that was running for president. It's central to our national conversation, and we're talking about it at the Bloomberg Equality Summit, which we probably might not have done a year ago even. So I think that the progress we've had in discussing this issue and mainstreaming it as a legitimate national conversation has been remarkable. We are living in an astonishingly tragic, if I can say, political time in the United States, but we're also seeing a mobilization around issues of racial justice taking place in the streets, in the media and elsewhere in ways that I also think were unimaginable a few years ago. So I'm more than happy to be surprised that this issue will become more and more relevant to our national political conversation.
Right. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I want to thank all of you. Kayandi Andrews from the Birmingham City University, Catherine Franke from Columbia, and Glenn Lowery from Brown University. Thank you all very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
At the end of 2017, we decided to take a hard look at the actual numbers, both in terms of our representation and our stories, but also on our TV programming and our radio programming. And the numbers really surprised us. About 10% of our outside guests that were brought onto TV were women.
I think we all can agree that the industry would be far better off for being more diverse.
What we heard from the bookers was that either they said that they couldn't find the women, there weren't women in the right roles that they were looking for, or if they found the woman didn't feel comfortable going on TV. And we thought the one thing that we could actually impact was this issue of the training. And we created an initiative called New Voices in 2018 to offer 4-hour one-on-one training for each woman that we brought in, to give them some video experience, some feedback, to learn about their messaging.
This is what I would say. I think quarterly earnings, we all get extremely focused on. It's a really good training. What I really learned is just understanding sometimes you may not want to answer that question, and just being able to pivot to something else entirely and getting your point across.
Something that really impressed me about this initiative is that it is without any expectation, and the program is fully confidential.
It's not necessary to go on Bloomberg TV after this. The idea is that you will be TV ready to voice your opinions, to share your perspective. The ultimate goal from a journalistic standpoint is that we have better programming, that we have more interesting conversations at events, and hearing opinions that we may not otherwise have voiced.
The only way to really achieve those goals is to have that representation within the financial news.
So we've more than doubled the percentage of women experts on our TV and radio.
Why do you think tech executives are putting their money and their muscle behind this now? I see the difference when we have more female voices on our show. There are new ideas, new insights.
Anyone really who's looking to grow professionally in their career is a fantastic opportunity to take up.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back to the Bloomberg Equality Summit. Romaine Bostic here, anchor for Bloomberg Television, here to continue on with that theme of this year's summit regarding inclusion in this age of disruption, now or never. And we really want to turn forward on that theme right now and talk about some of the ways and shine a light on this idea of supporting entrepreneurs, supporting entrepreneurship. And I'm pleased to say we have with us this morning Shu Niata. He's a managing partner over at SoftBank. He's actually the co-lead of a big multi-billion-dollar Latin America-focused technology growth fund. However, more importantly to this discussion today, he's co-spearheading an effort by SoftBank with a $100 million opportunity fund targeted at founders of color right here in the U.S. Also joining us today, Gemma Wolf. She oversees launch with Goldman Sachs. This is a big initiative as well, a $500 million initiative started a couple of years ago, designed to help early stage companies with diverse underpinnings increase their access to capital and facilitate a little bit of connections there. And I want to start with you, Gemma, on this note specifically, because amid all this attention that we've had this year from corporations and VCs and other funds to focus on racial equality, to focus on gender equality, it has to be sort of recognized that there were a lot of initiatives out there that predated the current turmoil that we're in. And one of those initiatives appeared to be launched with Goldman. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Romaine, thanks for having me. It's a really complicated time, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion today. As you mentioned, we started Launch with GS over 2 years ago, and we started it because we believe that this is good business. So Launch with GS is our $500 million diversity investment strategy. And as we enter our third year deploying capital, we've invested 330 of that original $500 million commitment. And we really focus on three main things. One, we invest directly in companies with diverse management teams. Two, we invest in private equity and venture capital funds with diverse leadership. And three, we're building out and supporting the ecosystem with events, content, resources, and connections. And we really think that those introductions can go a long way in supporting entrepreneurs.
And so when we talk about that support of entrepreneurs, you have this program started a couple of years ago. Earlier this year, SoftBank made a big splash in the news with the announcement of this opportunity fund, specifically designed to target Black and Native American and Latinx entrepreneurs. Shuniata, you are sort of the co-head of this effort. With that, can you tell us a little bit more, I guess, about how this came to fruition? Because if I remember correctly, it went from idea to inception pretty quickly.
Yeah, it was very reactive, actually. So we at SoftBank are global technology investors. We've been doing that for a long time. We haven't really been as focused on issues of domestic U.S. Social dynamics, really at all. And this year, we realized we had to change that position. So in June 3rd, I believe the day was, Marcelo Claure, who was my boss and one of the top 3 guys at SoftBank, said we have to do something. It can't be a press release. And so this was on a Monday, and on a Wednesday, we were on CNBC announcing the fund. So in 48 hours, we got out in front and announced a $100 million fund, and it's focused just on the U.S., just on Black, Latinx, Native American founders. And 3 or so months in, we have already a portfolio of over 15 companies.
And so just the willingness for people to embrace these ideas and to embrace them from the perspective of, I guess, a business initiative. I'm curious, Gemma, with regards to the types of people that the entrepreneurs that sort of look to be in your program, and more importantly, maybe some of the companies and other folks who want to also sort of help with those programs, are you finding enough of a reception amongst those sort of people to sort of collaborate and to continue building out the mission of what Launch with Goldman is supposed to be?
When we started the initiative over 2 years ago, we honestly didn't know what to expect. We knew and had a strong view that investing in diversity is good business. We believe that diverse management teams outperform, make better decisions, manage well through crisis. But when we announced, we were overwhelmed by the opportunity set. There is such a strong pipeline. We're actively reviewing opportunities, and we feel really confident and excited about what's out there. The other thing is that there's a lot of data that backs this up. So if you look at companies in the top quartile for gender and racial diversity, the numbers just speak for themselves. So on the racial and ethnic diversity front, companies in the top quartile are 33% more likely to deliver industry-leading profitability. And on the gender side, companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 21% more likely to outperform peers. And so once you start seeing those numbers and you see the pipeline and you see the opportunity set, I think a lot of people, and we're seeing this now, are seeing that this is a good business opportunity and this is returns-driving investment strategy.
When you look back, though, Gemma, sort of prior to when you started Launch with Goldman, there were always questions that were raised about corporate diversity, whether it was necessary, why companies needed to vote any sort of significant amount of resources or time to it. What changed in the ability to sort of get that data and to get the type, I guess, reinforced knowledge that there is sort of an actual cost benefit to pursuing these sort of diverse initiatives?
I think you really need to see examples and see it play out. So the data's been out there for a while, and we have a very strong view that diverse teams do outperform, but it goes beyond the numbers. You need to see real, tangible examples. And one of the things that we think is really important in order to see long-term change in the venture capital ecosystem is to have more diversity on the check writing side of the table. So investors who are starting funds, making decisions, connecting with entrepreneurs, joining their boards. And we've seen this play out. So one of the funds that we've backed is called Define Ventures. It's a digital healthcare fund started by a very talented investor named Lynn Chow O'Keefe. And it's funny because sometimes I try to call her and show her investment opportunities in the space, and she's already seen all of them. So there's nothing that she hasn't seen. A lot of people call her for her expertise. And it just happens, if you look at her portfolio, in her search for the best opportunities in the digital healthcare space, over 40% are led by diverse teams. And so I really do think that we need more examples. The numbers speak for themselves, and I think people are starting to see that.
Shu, so with regards to putting to work the money SoftBank has committed to this opportunity fund specifically, how easy has it been so far, I guess, to identify new opportunities? And what's sort of the general strategy here for, I guess, making sure that all that money gets invested?
Everyone talks about a pipeline problem. That's a common phrase you'll hear when people talk about any kind of minority groups needing funding or starting companies. We've seen no such thing. So since we announced this fund, we've looked at over 600 different companies very quickly who came into the funnel. Similar response to what Gemma described. We got overwhelmed by the interest, which was great. We love that. And we funded almost 15 companies. This is in 3 months. And we hear a lot, there are no companies to fund, but I think that's because people don't look in the right place. So the myopia of the industry is to us quite obvious at this point, having been doing this for 3 months, because we're excited about what's to come. And the point I'd make is we can talk about statistics and success metrics and all of that. The founders are very important to highlight. So Silicon Valley lionizes the outsider, the person with a chip on their shoulder who has overcome all odds to start a company with a clear idea and a lot of drive to succeed. If you abstract those qualities, they apply to a huge range of minorities in the US, because that's what you have to do to be a minority in the US. So these founders are in some sense very perfectly suited to starting new companies. Just people don't look for them in the right place. So our strategy is to find them, to have an open door, have them come in, give them a good hearing, help them succeed, and nothing more complicated than that.
Yeah, not complicated. Is it, Shu, is this, how should I put this? Is this philanthropy or is it business?
It's absolutely business. The only way you do discredit to this idea is by making it philanthropy, because the goal is to attract more capital, and capital follows returns. Capital doesn't care about anything else, really. And we want to prove that there is no trade-off. Just like Gemma said, this is good business. And we couldn't be, if you look at the list of companies that we're already investing in, they're across all kinds of categories, across all kinds of industries, and they're all high quality ideas with good entrepreneurs. So the goal is absolutely to have a very well-performing venture fund, because without that, you haven't really achieved much.
All right, we're speaking here with Shu Niata and Gemma Wolf, and we have a slide. I want to bring the audience into this discussion here because we are incorporating Twitter polling into this summit and into these live sessions. And the question for this session is, what do you think is the biggest obstacle facing diverse entrepreneurs? And you can see the responses here up on your screen for our viewers here. It said that 47.3% said access to funding, about 20% said bias in the business world, 27% said lack of mentorship, and only about 5% said lack of representation in key industries. And Gemma, I want to focus on that last one there, because I thought it was interesting that that had the lowest percentage of concern here. Shu sort of mentioned this idea of a pipeline and what's in that pipeline, what may not be in that pipeline. That type of response seems to suggest that maybe the pipeline isn't really the problem here when it comes to some of the inequality issues.
We completely agree with that. There's no pipeline issue. We see it every day. Our team is very busy, and there's a level of enthusiasm across Goldman Sachs and with our clients where people want to bring us opportunities. I think one thing that I will mention that's interesting about that poll is I think that the network gap is one of the biggest contributors to the investing gap. And what I mean by that is that warm introductions are so important in this business. And it's not just the warm introduction, but it's also setting that person up for success. What do they need to know going into that conversation? There was a study a couple years ago out of the UK that showed that a warm introduction is 13 times more likely to lead to funding than a cold introduction. And what I like about this is it's something that we can all do. If everyone wants to know, particularly those who are responding to the poll, how can I help? Well, you can make the introduction, open up your network, and then also help with the backstory. How can you position that person for success as they walk into that introduction?
Well, I mean, well, then on that note, Shu, an audience member is sending in a question at the door is open, as both you and Gemma suggest. The question is, how do you find that door? If you don't necessarily know the right person, or if you're not involved in Launch with Goldman, sort of how do you find that door, Shu, where you can sort of get that opportunity to shake a hand and pitch your deal?
Yeah, it's for us very simple. You either go to opportunityfund.com or you send an email to opportunityfund@softbank.com and you tell us about yourself. Attach your pitch deck for your business, describe what you're doing. We will look at and consider everything. That is what we're here for. it's very straightforward in our case.
It's straightforward. There are also issues being raised about whether, I guess, when we talk about that pipeline and we talk about these doors being open, as to whether enough people in the investment community and in corporate America recognize that. There were some comments that took Twitter by storm today. It was based on some comments that the CEO of Wells Fargo, Charlie Scharf, apparently made a couple of months ago to employees about having trouble filling some of the leadership positions with black and minority candidates because, in his words, he didn't feel that he said that there was a, quote, limited pool of those people. He has since apologized for those comments, we should point out in fairness. And it was part of a broader discussion that he was having within his own company about doubling the number of black leaders. I'm curious as to what the message is for people out there, for executives out there that maybe don't necessarily believe that that pipeline is as full as maybe you believe. Gemma?
So I think one of the dynamics that's actually really interesting that our team is talking about and that we're watching is whether the current environment and video conferencing, Zoom, Skype, if it's truly an equalizer, or if in fact it's limiting the opportunities and it's leading to more investing gaps. And what I mean by that is we know there's a strong pipeline. Shu mentioned it, we've seen it. There are so many opportunities to invest in really, really strong industry-leading companies across really a variety of sectors and industries. In the current environment, I'm hearing on the one hand from some entrepreneurs that video conferencing is removing some barriers to get to that funding. They don't have to fly out to Sand Hill Road every month. They don't have to worry about the costs and the time of being away from the business. They also don't have to think through, do I need to go to drinks the night before the pitch? How do I navigate this? On the other hand, we're seeing some VCs who are saying it is really hard to do business right now without meeting face-to-face with the entrepreneur. And so we're observing this, and honestly, I don't know what the answer is, and I'd actually love to hear from people on what they're seeing and what they're hearing, but I think it's important that we be aware of this so that we can ask the right questions around what's really leading to the investing gap. And Shu mentioned it, and I'll say it again, it is not a pipeline problem. And we do think that this network gap is a contributor to the investing gap.
There's a nuance here on the pipeline question, which is, as you move into the later and later stages of a company, there are fewer companies by founders of color. So the bulk of our pipeline that we've seen is earlier. And I think this gets to Charlie's point, is you have to start younger. You have to build the mass at the base to try and get leaders 5 or 10 years from now who you believe can succeed you at Wells Fargo. And for us, it's about funding companies early and helping them grow into bigger companies. You can't just expect big, magnificent companies to exist because of these structural limitations that have persisted for a while. So the pipeline is rich, but the pipeline is young, and we just have to accept that and help it grow up.
So I guess on a more esoteric level than Shu, is there, for those folks in the pipeline, are there enough examples for them to follow? I think when we all sort of start our careers or choose our careers, I think a lot of us can sort of point to times where we look at someone who looks like us or sounds like us and we say, okay, I can do that. I can do what he or she is doing. Do we have enough of those examples out there right now for black entrepreneurs to look to where they feel comfortable not only pursuing it, but feeling like that they can succeed at it?
Yeah, examples matter. So we call that lighthouse companies. And we have a few that we're investing in purely for the purpose of providing examples to some of the younger companies. So we have some more proven companies in the portfolio. We're courting some proven companies to try to get them in the portfolio, not because they can't raise money elsewhere, but because we need examples for others in that community. And the goal really is to build a community that is vulnerable with each other, that can learn from each other, that can overcome together.
And also,
Gemma,
just to add to that, we this year, actually over a year in the making, we ran our first Black and Latinx entrepreneur cohort. And I think it speaks to both sides of that because, first of all, it was an incredibly competitive process. We heard from over 400 different companies, and we really enjoyed the process of reading all of the applications and learning about the businesses. And we ultimately selected 14, and they participated in an 8-week experience with Goldman Sachs. And the whole thing was actually designed with founder input. And so even before COVID, it was all designed to be virtual. We heard from a lot of founders that what I really need to be doing is focusing on my business, but getting access to the Goldman Sachs network, getting access to the other founders in the cohort, and also getting access to founders who came before me and have already gone through this process would be incredibly valuable. And so we ran an 8-week experience with these 14 companies. And the great thing is that we're now talking to them all the time. So these companies are now part of our network, and we're looking forward to doing more.
And so once we start seeing more then of those success stories, then do you start to envision a little bit more exponential growth, and not only the folks coming out of that pipeline, but the amount of money committed to it? I mean, 500 million is a lot of money, 100 million is a lot of money. There are a lot of people that would say, why not $1 billion? Why not 5 billion? Shu?
It's not a lot of money. So it actually isn't in the venture world, but it's important to show success. That is the most important thing. If we overextend ourselves and fail, we have done a huge disservice to much more than SoftBank. So the goal is to start with a targeted amount of money, prove that this idea has financial merit, and grow from there. So we really want to show proof points in terms of returns, and that's why we started at the size we have. But the goal in 3 or 5 years is to have a lot more capital dedicated to these folks.
And Shu, just to be clear, and when you're judging success, I mean, what metric are you primarily looking at?
Returns. 100 million turns into X 100 million. And the bigger the X, the better for you.
Gemma?
I completely agree. I think one of the things that we're focused on is doing this with others. And so we now have clients calling us interested in, well, how should I think about this in my portfolio, and how can I support entrepreneurs? And so I'm very confident that that number will grow. And I completely agree with Shu that we need to see the outcomes and drive results. And I think the more success stories that you see with entrepreneurs growing and scaling businesses, their employees go on and they start businesses and they start investing in other companies. And so there really is an ecosystem effect here that will all only benefit if we keep doing this and if we keep focusing on finding the right opportunities.
All right. Well, we're running out of time, and I think that's probably a good note to end on here. I mean, these are just 2 great initiatives out there right now in the world of finance, design, of course, to support diverse entrepreneurship. I want to thank Shu Niata, of course, a managing partner over at SoftBank, and of course, helping to spearhead that $100 million opportunity fund over there. And of course, Gemma Wolf, of course, who oversees launch with Goldman Sachs, a big $500 million initiative there at that firm. And in addition to thanking our speakers, of course, I also want to take time to thank all of our audience out there who are listening in to this year's Bloomberg Equality Summit. And I also want to thank Google Cloud for supporting this live session within today's virtual event. This has already been a great lineup that we've had so far this morning. Of course, you just heard from Shu as well as Gemma. We heard a little bit earlier from Hillary Rodham Clinton and a few others. Coming up in the next hour, at the top of the hour, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into overcoming barriers. There's going to be a big focus there on mental health and disabilities. We're going to have Alyssa Milano, the actor and activist, as well as Dominic Reed, the CEO of Invictus, Chuck Robbins, CEO of Cisco, and a real treat really coming up a little bit later in that hour with Jim Fitterling, of course, the chairman and CEO of Dow, who has just a phenomenal backstory in his climb up the corporate ladder. He's really going to talk a lot about what it means to build a better company. So all that and more coming up. Stay connected, stay tuned, hashtag Bloomberg Equality. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm placing new order for euro. I want to buy at 116.66. Okay, 116.66, order placed. Position opened long for euro against United States dollar at 116.66.
We come from every walk of life. We're proud of who we are and what we believe. We are among the 200,000 people who work for Bank of America. What would you like the power to do?
2020, a devastating year rocked by the pandemic and protests. More than 26 million people infected with coronavirus. Too many lives lost. Some communities are harder hit. In the United States,
health disparities have always existed for the African American community.
In Europe,
it's impossible to be with distance with each other.
A string of police killings of unarmed black Americans shocked the world, sparking global protests. The need for inclusion and equality has never been more urgent.
Consumers want to see commitment and to the black community and support.
We convene leading figures in business, finance, and health for uncomfortable but crucial conversations that cannot wait. It's now or never. This is the Bloomberg Equality.
Okay, as you can see, I am placing a stop on profit for euro, and stop on profit goes, if I bought 1666, it goes to 116.71. Okay, people who follow my trades probably understand how I place on profit, stop on profit, how it works. So basically, I don't have to explain. For other guys who just joined my live trading channel, you can get the strategy on ticker. You can see red color. Strategy is available there. They're full course, and you will find out basically how it works, how to buy, how to hedge, why I hold more short positions, less long positions, why it's more profitable to hold like these positions. By the way, why broker pays me to hold short positions, how much, all of these you can find basically from the strategy. Okay, so I place stop on profit, and as you know, if it will reach the level 116.71, I will get £500 in profit. Okay, speak to you later, guys.
The coronavirus crisis has painfully reminded us of the many institutional barriers that minorities and communities of color face every day. But it has also impacted workers with disabilities, including those with mental health issues. To truly embody our mission for more inclusive workplaces in the future, we must go further to bring more of these incredible individuals into our organizations. I'm confident that if we continue working together, listening to our colleagues at events like this one, and taking action, we will achieve that goal. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and please enjoy the rest of the summit.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shortia Brantley, Deputy New York Bureau Chief and Senior Editor of Bloomberg Equality. I'm so pleased you could join us for the Bloomberg Equality Summit. Our theme is Now or Never, Inclusion in the Age of Disruption. 2020 has reminded us of the urgency with which we need to create a more equal society. We simply cannot wait. Our next session focuses on disability and mental health, what it takes to thrive, not just survive, during this pandemic. But first, I'd like to welcome Ann B. Oxrider, Senior Vice President and Benefits Executive at Bank of America, our sponsor for this session.
Hello, my name is Ann Oxrider, and I work for Bank of America as part of our Global Benefits Organization with responsibility for our emotional wellness strategies. We are honored to sponsor the Bloomberg Equality Summit for the third consecutive year. Now more than ever, it is critical that we come together as organizations and leaders around the world to drive equality across all sectors of society. At Bank of America, diversity and inclusion are part of our fiber and core to our focus on being a great place to work for our more than 212,000 teammates around the world. Our commitment to diversity starts at the top with our board of directors and our CEO. It is affirmed in the work that we do both inside and outside of our organization. More than 50% of our workforce are women. More than 45% of our U.S. workforce are people of color. 50% of our management team is diverse. And we are proud to be one of only 4 S&P companies with 6 or more women on the board. Gender, race, and ethnic diversity are cornerstones to ensuring we are creating diverse and inclusive environments. But to be truly inclusive, we must acknowledge that there are also other less visible differences. 2 of these are the focus of the conversations that you are about to hear. The first is mental health and the goal of removing the stigma so often associated with mental illness and removing the barriers that prevent someone from seeking the support that they need. And the support of individuals with both seen and unseen physical or developmental disabilities. This happens to be the 30th anniversary of the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the United States. And it's also the 30th anniversary of a unit within Bank of America's Support Services, Fulfillment, and Marketing Group, which today employs over 300 teammates with developmental disabilities. These teammates play an integral role in the delivery of information to our employees and clients worldwide. At Bank of America, supporting the well-being of all of our teammates and their family members is our #1 priority. We recognize the additional strains that individuals are feeling this year due to the impacts of the coronavirus and the heightened racial tensions. As a company, we have come together. Across Bank of America, we are committed to our fellow teammates, to helping one another, and to living our values. As part of that, we provide a wide variety of emotional wellness support to target the unique needs of teammates, from supporting the trauma of racial injustice to easing the burdens of child and elder care, helping build resiliency and skills related to mindfulness, and providing access at no cost to experts in the behavioral health field. On behalf of Bank of America, thank you for your commitment to creating diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplaces and communities.
Thanks, Ann. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping announcements to ensure you can all enjoy the program. For today's event, we have partnered with Thyssen, an audio-to-text platform that is transcribing today's discussions in real time, making the event more accessible. You can access Thyssen for the real-time transcription via the link in the session description. If you experience any issues with audio or video quality while viewing, try to refresh your browser or use the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen for support. You'll be able to submit questions during the interviews, and we really hope you do, so please engage with us. While we're probably not going to get to all of you, we'll certainly try our best. To submit a question, please click open the white tab on the right-hand side of the video window and submit your question. If you note your name and geographical location, we'll give you a shout out. Please engage with us on social media using hashtag #BloombergEquality. With that, I hand it over to my colleague, Carol Masser, co-anchor of Bloomberg Business Week Television and Radio, who is joined by Alyssa Milano, actress and activist.
Welcome, everyone. Well, our next guest is someone that you know of, and she has pretty much lived most of her life in the public eye. She's also someone who has allowed us into her personal life before, and she's letting us do so again today. Alyssa Milano, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, and I want to kick off with, because one of the things that we've talked about a lot here during the pandemic is not only our physical well-being, but our mental well-being and mental health. And what's interesting is, and we're going to get into anxiety and mental illness overall, but you had COVID-19 months ago, and you're still feeling the impact of that. How are you doing? Tell me kind of where you are in this.
It's interesting. It vacillates. Some days I feel back to normal, and other days it's like I have a recurrence of the acute symptoms. I was sick with the acute illness for 5 weeks in March and April, and I have not felt back to normal since then. Some days I feel okay, but really it's just this incredible exhaustion. It feels like I have no motivation to physically move my body, and I don't know if that is some sort of mental protection or if it's my body trying to regenerate or what is happening. But I have shortness of breath, heart palpitations, my hair is still falling out, and I have the worst part, I have this ringing in my ears that is driving me bonkers. So yeah,
not great.
It has not been great, and it's interesting because of all my friends. I have quite a few friends that were sick. There's maybe 1 out of 12 that feels completely back to normal. The rest are just having these long hauler symptoms, and so we find great comfort in each other, knowing that there are other people out there going through the same thing, and that makes a really big difference. And I think that makes a big difference in our mental health in general, just to know that there are other people that go through similar things that we do.
Well, this is why we're so grateful that you're talking with us and talking about your own mental illness and talking about anxiety. And I want to take a few steps back, because from what I understand, just doing a little bit of research and watching some different things and some interviews you've done, you've dealt with anxiety for a long time. Is that fair?
Oh, yes. Yes, but I don't know that I had labeled it as anxiety, but my earliest recollection, and everybody experiences anxiety differently. For me, I get in a crisis mode that is very hard for me to break the pattern. And basically it gets to the point that my brain just thinks that's the way it's supposed to be functioning in fight, flight, or freeze. And I should also say is when we're talking about issues that affect the brain, we really prefer to talk about mental health, not mental illness. I think once we start calling it mental illness, that's when the stigma comes with that. And also to try to sort of be conscious of the phrases that we use, as far as like, I actually just did it and I caught myself, that the ringing in my ears was driving me bonkers. Like all of those things, all of those natural ways of describing things in the past, we sort of have to break out of, I think, in order to break the stigma. But my earliest recollection of being in crisis mode was I lived in South Africa for 3 months in 2000. And it was, only 9 years after apartheid was abolished. And I volunteered in a township in a children's hospital. And I was very strong while I was there. When I came home and had to assimilate, like, that part of me that volunteered and dedicated my time to helping other people and trying to assimilate that with the person that lived in Beverly Hills and drove a BMW, I had a very hard time getting back and getting acclimated. And I went through about, and at this time I didn't know, but I would say 4 or 5 months of complete and total panic. anxiety. And for me, I have generalized anxiety disorder and I also get panic attacks. So what that basically means is my base level of anxiety is almost in a panic attack mode. And then my panic attacks are sort of on top of that. So I remember I went to my general practitioner and I wasn't even in therapy, which by the way, if there was anyone that needed to be in therapy, it was a child actor that survived, right?
But was there anybody around you? Was there anybody around you saying, wait a minute, Alyssa, this isn't right. You shouldn't feel this way chronically, and that would step in?
I mean, my mom I have a lot of the same characteristics as my mother. She suffers from anxiety. She also has dyslexia. I have dyslexia as well. So she was encouraging me to go, but I went to my general practitioner and they put me on a very generic antidepressant, which made me, gain 15 pounds. And that was like a whole other issue. And plus I was working 80 hours a week. I was working on charm. And so it was very hard to take that sort of break and self-care.
I want to bring you forward a little bit, because from what I understand, it really became, I guess, very debilitating after the birth of your son, Milo. Tell us a little bit about what happened, right? You came home, and I know there were some complications or some stress just before he was delivered. Tell us what happened.
So I was in labor for 18 hours. I pushed for 3.5 hours, and he came to us via C-section. The birth itself and the labor itself was very traumatic. Not to get too graphic, but when a woman says she pushes for 3 hours, it is with the help of nurses who are basically trying to manipulate the baby while it's still inside of your body to get the baby out. So for me, it felt incredibly invasive and traumatic. And I think that it triggered my sexual assault trauma.
Right.
Because I was sitting there and I was thinking, why does this feel like such a violation? This does not feel, and I don't think women talk about this at all.
And you're not in control, and it's right. You're not in control. It's a very tough situation, very heated.
And there's lots of people coming in the room and plugging things in, and my mom used to joke, if they had a car in there, they'd be backing that in just to so that I think is what triggered my postpartum anxiety. And then I had, I felt better. My milk came in, I felt better. I had this beautiful little delicious baby. And it was when he weaned himself very suddenly without any going down. My hormones were out of control. And that's when my anxiety started to come back again, was when my hormone level dipped after he weaned, which was at 10 months. So then I had this experience where go ahead.
No. I was going to say, you eventually found yourself in the ER room, right? In the wee hours of the morning.
Yes. But before that, the part of this story that I think is almost the most important is I went into my OBGYN when this first started happening, and she looked at me, and with a straight face, she said to me, well, it's a big life change. Go for a hike. Try to find some self-care time. And by the way, she said to me, you're 38 years old, so if you want to have another baby, we should probably start thinking about that. And I remember so clearly just being in tears, and I looked at her and I said, I'm not sure I want the baby that I have right now. And you're talking to me about another baby? So I felt completely like the health care that I was getting was totally not where it should have been. So I would just go to the emergency room. I would go to the emergency room every time I felt like I couldn't deal.
Well, and one of the times that you went, you actually had yourself committed, right, for 3 days.
I did.
Why did you do that? Why did you do that? Why did you know you needed to do that?
So at the time I was working on Mistresses, which was a show on ABC, and I was still functional and I was still able to learn my lines and show up for work. And the thing about mental health, and when you're struggling with mental health issues, is you can't see it, right? Someone looks completely together and healthy. And so I knew that the only way that I was going to get adequate care, that the production would understand that I needed to take time off, only if, and I think women feel this in every industry, if they could see the severity. And I didn't think that there was a way for them to see the severity without going into a facility for 3 days. And I have to tell you that experience really saved my life. And I had very little support, like my parents, you know, they're very supportive now, but at the time, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, because my mother had her own mental health issues, they were very much of the school of buck up, get over it.
Well,
you're gonna be okay.
I was going to say to you that I think so many of us think, well, I'm just stressed out right now. I'm overworked. I'm just worried. I'm, you know, there's just too much going on in my life. And we tend to shrug these things off. And it's something that you actually said that you didn't anymore.
Yeah, I'm not sure the severity of what I was feeling. Excuse me, it's the truth.
Bless you.
Thank you. I'm not sure that anyone could shrug off what I was feeling and how severe it was. Otherwise, I would have been the first one to shrug it off. So yeah, so very, very, very difficult time. But what happened was I went in and I started mapping out when I was in the facility, I started mapping out when my anxiety came. And sure enough, it always had to do with my cycle and always had to do with my hormone levels. So what this doctor that I saw there told me was, you know, this happens to women. Nobody had ever said this before to me. And he suggested that I go see this doctor that specializes in women's mental health and hormonal imbalances. And that is still the team that I have to this day.
What do you think was the toughest part of this? You know, facing the illness, asking for help, working on a recovery, or was it all hard?
It was the feeling. The feeling. The rest of it, look, I've lived my entire life in the public eye. There was no way that I wasn't going to share this part of who I am. But the physical sensation of being in your body with when you're struggling with mental health issues. And here's the thing. I had resources at my disposal. I could go to the emergency room. I had health insurance. I had people in my life. I had a job that I could take off from. The thing that terrifies me and the thing that I understand is when people are going through this alone, when single mothers are going through any mental health issue, or someone that doesn't have a supportive family or doesn't have the resources to get help, that's when people self-medicate. That's when people turn to drugs and alcohol. That's
or give up.
Or give up. And so,
well, you know,
I think
this is something I wanted to ask you because it's the Equality Summit. And what we do is we look at equality from so many different ways. The virus has reminded us, right, that people don't have equal access to health care. What do you think? And forgive me for doing this, but I'm just curious because you're educated about this. You've learned about it. You do understand that you were privileged in having great health care and access and support. But what would have happened? I mean, do you think if you didn't have all of that?
I don't think there was a choice. I had to have that. I had to figure out a way out. And for most people, the only way out is in. right, is really taking a deep dive. And I also want to say that there have been flare-ups since then, but I haven't been sick, the last 9 years there totally. There were flare-ups, like when I sent out the Me Too tweet, and I started getting responses from women about their own sexual trauma that triggered my sexual trauma, and how I had to sort of fess up to the fact that I'd never really dealt with it, that I kept pushing it, and you cannot do that because your brain will misfire, and I'm really, I think the message of equality and the message of women's health in this conversation, independent of anything else, when you think about, certain cancers like ovarian cancer, and how there is no test for it, and it seems like there's no rush to find a test. These are the issues, the inequality that we face as women in healthcare that goes beyond, sadly, mental health.
Well, it's interesting that we're having this conversation. Here we are in a week where, the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and there are concerns about what that means for Obama's healthcare plans and what that means for women's rights. So, what you talk about is so relevant. I do want to ask you, and I have to say, anxiety and mental health issues are near and dear to me, and I have family and extended family members who struggle with that. Why is this so important that you use your platform to get this out to people, to talk about it, to share another very personal thing of your life? Yeah.
We have to get away from the fact that this is bad or that there's stigma attached to it. I believe that seeing a mental health professional should be as common as going to the dentist twice a year for a health checkup, for a tooth health checkup. And by the way, that is how I'm raising my children. We call it, with my kids, we call it a feelings doctor. And they both have, a feelings doctor where, you're going to go in to get your teeth cleaned. You're going to go in to get your vaccinations and your shot. And you're going to check in with someone who specializes in feelings to know that what you're feeling in your heart is okay and is normal. And I think if we can erase that stigma and make healthcare more accessible to people who struggle with mental health issues, then I think we're going to be better for it as a society, and it's certainly a happier society.
I agree, and I don't want to, I'm all Bloomberg, and I don't want to go all economic and productivity, but all of this, your physical health, your mental health, they all have an impact on your ability to live a really full life, and whether it's on your personal life or also in your workplace. I mean, these are costs if we want to go there, but there are costs to society by not doing this. I do wonder.
Absolutely.
I do wonder.
Absolutely,
is there
especially
anything
when you think about like the fact that we don't have paid maternity leave, and how we don't have early free childcare. I mean, women contribute a lot to this economy, and when we take those options away from women, what we're taking also away is for them to help with economic growth within our country.
Alyssa, as we get ready to wrap up this conversation, is there something you'd like to leave our group with that kind of gives you hope? Because as you say, it needs to be like going to the dentist and getting, your annual physical. Your mental health needs to be checked regularly. Is there anything that gives you hope?
Conversations like this give me hope. So thank you so much. My kids give me hope in that we may be able to, in my family, break this cycle of, my grandmother hasn't left the house in 32 years. So my mission is, my mother has struggled. I have struggled. I'm going to give my children everything, all the tools that they possibly need to break this genetic, hereditary, generational trauma, so that and I have hope that every family can do that. And I will continue to fight to make sure that people have access to healthcare so that they can take care of their mind and their brain the same way you take care of your heart and your tummy.
We're going to leave it on that note. I love what you're doing with your kids, and this whole idea of breaking the cycle, I think is so important. Alyssa, thank you so much for sharing this with you, and really wish you well. Stay safe.
I really appreciate the opportunity to share.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Coons, a reporter at Bloomberg News. I cover mental health for Bloomberg. In some of my reporting, I've come to learn how important it is how a CEO's views on mental health in the workplace really inform a company's culture. So I'm joined today by Chuck Robbins, the CEO of Cisco. Chuck, thanks for coming to the Equality Summit and discussing this today.
Me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk about mental health as a form of equality in the workplace. And I wanted to start out with how you came to understand that this was a critical issue for your workforce and something that you needed to address head on rather than maybe remain in where it was in the shadows for many years up until probably the last 5 years or so. It's become a more prevalent dialogue.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a really important topic, so I'm glad you're covering it. It is, and it's been obviously highlighted in the last 6 to 9 months for people through this pandemic. But, you know, it all started as what I would characterize as a transactional response to some events that occurred when Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain both committed suicide within like a week's time. And I was sitting in my office and I was just thinking to myself that I'm sure we have employees who are struggling with mental health issues. And wow, what if they watched these two suicides and decided that that's the right outcome for them? And so I walked into my head of HR, walked into her office and said exactly that. You know, I don't want people to feel this way. So we made a decision. We crafted together an email to the company that just said, look, we recognize that people could be struggling. There are always, you know, issues. And we highlighted all the support resources that we have and told them that we're here for you. And, you know, and it was really just trying to do anything we could to just, if we could insert and influence someone who might be struggling at that moment in time. And the result of that was overwhelming. I didn't understand what we were opening up, to be honest. And the feedback and the email responses that we got to that were just incredible, with all these stories and the gratitude, stories about their children or their friends or themselves. And subsequent to that, we had employees who were willing and wanted to stand up in front of the entire company and tell their story so they could help someone else not go through whatever it was that they had gone through. And so it just magnified for me that this is a serious issue that is quite prevalent. And then from that point forward, we've built a much more, I'd say, regular communication plan. We have more updates on it. Then as we got into the pandemic, we realized that even more people are suffering. And so we implemented more things as we've gotten into that. But it was that initial situation that actually brought this to the forefront for us.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? So you mentioned the pandemic, and that created, with the physical distancing, a lot of isolation for people. And you've also had the compounded effect of the wildfires, adding another layer of quarantining to people who've already been isolated for some time. How have you responded to that? What are examples of maybe benefits and ways that you've reached out to your employee base and tried to keep this conversation going at a time when so many people are stuck at home?
Yeah, it is it's been interesting. And what we did when the pandemic first hit is we started a weekly video meeting with all of our employees. So we invited all 77,000 people to join us every week for an hour and 15 minutes. And early on, the topics were very related to the actual, COVID situation, the virus itself, and how to understand what was going on. So we had lots of medical personnel that were joining these calls, and we were talking a lot about that particular situation at the time. And we talked about everything from testing to, we've given updates on what we think is happening with vaccines and therapeutics all along the way. But early on, it became very clear that people who were now at home, in many cases, they were people who lived by themselves. And, the first few months, people really stayed in. And in some cities, they still are. Some people have gotten a little more flexible where you're doing a little more, but you're being cautious. But early on, people really stayed in. And so you had employees who lived by themselves and felt very isolated. You had employees who all of a sudden found themselves in very small homes without a home office, trying to work from home with 2, 3, 4 very young children at home. You have employees who had elderly parents living with them, and then the fear of somehow COVID getting to your elderly parents who are much more at risk created stress. And then just the lack of knowledge about how this thing is going to end. And when you have all those pressures and you don't know when it's going to end, it creates more mental stress, anxiety, and depression. And so we then brought mental health experts onto these calls that we were having every week. And we've gone to every 2 weeks now, but the same experts are still there for any questions that arise. And then we've subsequently hosted a number of mental health sessions for our employees. We've doubled and tripled the number of sessions that we're making available. We've put benefits in place to help our employees with childcare, make sure they understand everything we can do for those who are treating elderly parents or dealing with that. So we've just really doubled down everything that we were doing to try to make sure that we're taking care of our employees right now. And it's a very complicated time. So,
do you have any sense out of all of these benefits that you've rolled out, what's the most utilized at this stage? What people are really gravitating towards?
Well, I think the sessions that we've
Position closed on euro at 116.71. We have 500 pounds in profit. Okay.
For people to engage with experts who can just make them feel better about the situation or give them some coping mechanisms for what they're dealing with. And you don't necessarily make it go away, but if you can help people, figure out how they can deal with it more effectively. And I've told even my direct team, I said, right now, during this time, you need to find your own therapy. What is your therapy right now? Because I need it. My wife needs it. Everyone needs to, what is it that gives you that mental break? We've told our employees, if you need to block an hour in the middle of the day to go for a walk because that's what recharges you and gives you the break you need, then do that. Block it. Take control of your time. We really had to explain to our leadership teams that very issue is that you have employees that have small children at home, and that 3-year-old doesn't really care that you scheduled a meeting at 1 o'clock in the afternoon if they need their parent at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And so you're going to have to be very empathetic, and you're going to have to be very flexible, and you're going to have to be willing to say, hey, let's reschedule. You take care of your child. And those kinds of things just help take the pressure off of the folks that are trying to deal with this. So there's a whole lot of those things that we've tried to do as well. And look, we're learning all along. We didn't open up the how to deal with a pandemic handbook when we started this. We've just been learning and trying to do the best we can. So.
Yeah, I can relate to that myself. I have small children at home, and they've definitely, like you said, not necessarily respected the meeting schedule all of the time.
Well, they may pop in any minute.
They're not here right now, so but we have had quite a few incidents where they just try to jump in my lap in the middle of something, and so I think it's really, really good to address that head on and just say we understand what's happening here, because I think people really need to hear that. That's really actually quite critical. So in this scenario now, we have potentially months more to go of parents, say, not having childcare and having to manage work. For a company like your own, have you always been pretty flexible on hours and people work when they're able, or is this something you've kind of had to adapt to and change? Are you working off a base where people were already kind of arranging their schedule based on how they could manage their life within the realm of having normal childcare hours? Or is this something you sort of came at because March and April hit like they did and really changed the way we approached our time?
We've always had a culture of supporting, the traditional notion of work-life balance, which is obviously an interesting thing to actually discuss. But I've always told our employees, if your child has a sports event at 2:30 in the afternoon, you should go, because my belief is that after you put them to bed at night, you're probably going to be doing email at 9:30. And so, and helping think through, we need to focus on the outcomes that our employees are delivering, and not how they do it or when they do it. And so this notion of taking that flexibility, we've always had that, at least culturally. And I'm not saying every leader in our company has dealt with it and supported it the way we would want them to, but that's been our overarching approach. And we had employees already working from home, but this notion of working from home with your children around in that situation is much different. I actually watched your faces. I said that a couple of times about the children. I could tell you had kids at home just by your facial reactions. But I'll tell you, it was an interesting time. Early on, I have a 4-year-old granddaughter, and early on during the pandemic, she was at our house, and she opened my office door during one of our check-ins. And it just struck me at that moment, this is perfect, because I want them to see that it even happens to me. And so I actually pulled her into the video and introduced her to all of our employees so that they would know this is how it's going to be going forward. And I think that I do think this is an aspect of this pandemic that is going to stay with us. I think people are going to be a lot more understanding about what else is going on in your life when you're working from home or whatever. I can remember when we first started working from home, you would be mortified if your dog barked. It's like, and now, here we are. And so I think this is going to change how we think about it in the future as well.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. It seems like a revolution that got sped up, because I think some of these conversations were happening in some corners of corporate America and maybe not everywhere. And I think it's really accelerating right now. Now, another major event that happened in the spring were the Black Lives Matter protests and the elevation of the dialogue on systemic racism. And that's obviously also translated into a lot of companies coming out and talking about diversity in the workforce, representation, why representation matters, how to improve diversity in the diversity and inclusion in the workplace. How have you at Cisco addressed that topic within this broader topic? It is also potentially somewhat related to some of your own employees' mental health, but it's also just an important conversation topic about making sure that you're attracting and recruiting and retaining the most diverse talent you can.
Yeah, first of all, the events that have occurred and the deaths of these individuals are just abhorrent. I mean, it is, as we've said, and many of us have said in leadership roles, it is time for action. And empathy is nice, but it's time for action. And so there's an awful lot that many of the CEOs in the United States have been active in working on, whether it's police reform or whether it's your own company and how you're dealing with diversity. I will say that ironically, back in the fall of 2019, we had actually kicked off an initiative to understand better the experience of our African-American Black employees at Cisco. And we've long had a focus on gender, and I think we finally broke through and started making progress. We're not where we need to be, but we made progress, and we continue to make progress. So we wanted to apply some of those same learnings to different communities inside the company. And so the African-American and Black community was the first that we chose. And so we had a little head start, and we had a group of Black leaders inside the company who were helping inform us about their experience and what worked, what didn't work, what was good, what was bad, what needed to change, what we needed to accelerate. And we had this, I have Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative is a good friend of mine. And if you read his book, he talks about getting proximate to the problems or the situation. And when you get proximate to something, you understand it better. And then you want to solve it, or you know how to solve things more effectively. And so we'd taken that strategy, and we actually had taken about 18 of our African-American Black employees, and my entire leadership team, we met with them for about 3 hours at my house. And they actually, we had a moderator who coordinated a whole discussion around their experience. And it was so moving to hear. It was it was encouraging and it was devastating at the same time to hear how they felt at different times. And many of them had been with us for 15, 20 years, and they loved the company, but they wanted certain things to change. And so we then kicked off a 100-day sprint. And so there was a lot of activity going on around that actually then that informed how we created our social justice response in the midst of everything going on in the country. And so, we're doing all the things you would expect. We're obviously trying to increase the diversity of our employee base, our leadership, our executive team, and our board. We are trying to create more talent pipeline, both internally, as well as some investments that we're announcing with HBCUs, as well as we have Net Academy, which is a Cisco educational program around the world where there'll be 3 million students that will go through it this year. So a real focus on the African-American Black community. And venture capital funding that we're going to put into these kinds of spaces. And so there's a whole list of things that we as a company are trying to do. And we've had very open dialogue with our employees about where we are and what we need to do differently and what we're planning on doing. And I think that, to your point, for our African-American and Black employees, on top of the pandemic, it's been an incredibly stressful time. And then to your other point, the fires, the tropical storms, the hurricanes, I mean, this has been a heck of a year. But hopefully we learn from this and we never go back. And we actually make sustainable progress because we need to.
So it's interesting you came at this, you'd done this work in gender, and then you wanted to sort of take key learnings from your Black and African-American leaders within the organization. What surprised you when you said you did that group meeting and you heard from people firsthand? What were the things that really stuck out that you really didn't see coming in terms of things that you really needed to do better in the workplace or in recruiting or wherever it may be?
Yeah, there were a couple things that struck me. Number one, how much they love the company, but then to hear some of their frustrations, but they were still here because they love the company. And some of the specifics were, there were people who would tell us how long they'd been in the same job grade without a promotion. Right? And so we had one of the big things that was a part of that 100-day sprint was we had built a pay parity system years ago, like 4 or 5 years ago. And when we first ran it, we were running it primarily for the gender pay parity issues. And what our team realized is that it highlighted pay parity issues across also the entire spectrum of individuals. There were white males that needed adjustments because they weren't paid at a same level. What we hadn't looked at is promotion equity, right, or promotion parity. So that was one of the big things that we went and looked at it. And we made a huge amount of progress and had a much higher percentage of our African-American Black employees that have been promoted in the last 6 months as a result of this. So that was one example. But I think just the things that have occurred in 2020 that have led to such a list of actions and this outrage and this focus on social justice, I think have just given us more energy. It's unfortunate, but it's given us more energy to actually continue to make progress on this. And we're having a broader discussion with our entire employee base, and I think it's been very constructive. So we have a long way to go, but we're making progress.
Well, we probably only have time for one more question, so I'd be curious what you sort of think are now best practices from the work you've been doing so far in mental health and in diversity and inclusion, things that you would want to share with other leaders if they want to even just get this conversation started or make some of the progress or start to make some of the progress that you guys are working on.
Yeah, well, look, we have a lot to learn and we have a long way to go, first of all, but I will tell you that the number one thing is don't be afraid to have the conversation, because I think that's been the issue. And when you don't understand something and you perhaps can't relate to it, it's very difficult to wade into that discussion. And so when we had an emergency company-wide meeting on like the Monday after George Floyd's death, and I had Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation, and I had Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative join me on that call. And I actually opened up the call by saying to our African-American Black employees, look, I want to ask forgiveness from you up front for anything that we might say that is wrong, because we want to get into this conversation, but in many cases we won't know what to say. And I think just putting that out there and just diffusing it ahead of time and saying, look, we're here to achieve positive things for all of our employees. So we're going to learn together. We're going to talk about this together. And we're going to continue to make progress together. And I think you just have to be willing to get into the discussion. And when you do, when you make it okay for your employees, they will actually take over and will begin to lead you. And it'll become very clear what you need to do. With the mental health thing, it was like I sent an email, but the employee response defined what we needed to do next. And the same was true when we began the conversation on the African American Black community. They actually defined our path, and now we're just executing with them on that. And I think that would be my advice to any leaders who are thinking about really taking, a deeper dive into these topics and these areas that are super important for our employees and our society.
Well, thanks so much. I think these are great ideas. These are great conversations to be having with your workers. I think people probably really appreciate this. It's really great to hear it, even not as a Cisco employee, just to know that this work is being done in big organizations to make sure that the conversations that many of us are having with our peers or friends are being had with our companies as well. So I appreciate you sharing this time with us, and thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Cynthia, and good luck. Stay safe.
You too.
Hello, my name is Pamela Hutchinson, and I'm the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Bloomberg. And it's an honor and a privilege to be here today in discussion with Dominic Reed, OBE, and CEO of the Invictus Games Foundation, and Shani Danda, award-winning disability specialist, speaker, and entrepreneur. Welcome. Dominic, as I was preparing for the session today, I was thinking about what it must have been like for you when you got the call to lead on the Invictus Games. I know you've done some amazing events and they've been phenomenal and very visible, but surely this must have been one that gave you pause for thought.
It absolutely did. I mean, it was at one time fantastic, and at another terrifying, really. I mean, it was an incredible opportunity. But if I look back at my career, I mean, a lot of what I'd done was commemorative. I've worked with veterans a lot, but I was working typically with veterans from the Second World War who were coming towards the end of their lives and getting some sort of recognition. And this is a very different thing. This is about affecting people as they progress along their recovery pathway. So these are young people, and we were delivering real-time help and support on their recovery journey, which is an amazing thing to do. The other thing, of course, is that the scale of it and the time scale in which we had to deliver it was extraordinary. So we had 9 months from getting the phone call to delivering the games in the Olympic Park, and we had a colossal profile to build. So it was quite an adventure.
Was there at any point you thought, I'm not sure if I can actually do this? I can pull it off.
Well, no, we had. I mean, I wasn't alone. We had a great board headed by Sir Keith Mills, with a lot of his colleagues from the London 2012 board, and we had a fantastic team of people. We had people embedded within the MOD. We had people from CSM who were specialists in delivering sports events. So we had a good team. I think we knew that we could deliver an amazing event. I think there were two things that we probably didn't know. We didn't know how it would play with the general public, how they would take these stories, this kind of sport, to their hearts. We'd already seen London 2012 and the great success of the Paralympics, but this was a different thing. These are people who weren't known quantities. There weren't characters and personalities that people were aware of. And the other was, they're not professional sports people. So was the sport going to be compelling to watch, or was it just not? And the answer to both those things exceeded all of our expectations. I mean, it was an amazing event that the public warmly took to heart, and it was a broad public. It was not just people who you'd expect to support military charities. These were people who maybe didn't have an affinity with the military, maybe didn't agree with the wars, but were completely bought in by the human story, by these incredible stories of people overcoming adversity and life-changing injury, which was very, was wonderful to see. And the other thing, of course, was that the sport was incredibly compelling. So sometimes watching somebody come over the line last was the dramatic moment of the day.
No, I can see that. So look, you had the tools and you got on with the job. And talking of people who get on with the job, I'm going to turn, if I may, to you, Shani. You are so proactive and passionate about disability. You have achieved an incredible amount. But, just because you're disabled doesn't necessarily make you predisposed to campaign for disabled rights. And yet you have. Why is it so important to you, and why have you personally engaged with this agenda?
Sure. So, being truthfully honest, it wasn't really something that I had big ambitions to set out to do. As a child, I thought, when I'm older, this is what I want to do. And it happened really organically through just talking about my experiences, and then other people encouraging me to share that wider. As my perspective is pretty unique, I'm a South Asian woman who experiences disability, and I grew up without any sort of role models, anyone relatable that I could look up to, that I felt shared a similar path or story to me. And after continually feeling underrepresented in society, I was really motivated to challenge perceptions and change attitudes by becoming the change that I wanted to see, not only for myself, but for also future generations as well.
And it's interesting. I mean, I'm often asked, sort of people assume that just because I'm a Black woman, that this is, of course, why I'm doing diversity and inclusion. And there's always a backstory. And I know there's a backstory with you too. So can you give us a bit more of the backstory, your upbringing, and how that helped shape you to be the woman that you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born with a rare genetic condition called osteogenesis imperfecta. It's more commonly known as brittle bone disease. And due to that, I have a short stature of 3'10". So just to put that into context, I'm 33 years old and I'm about the height of a very tall 4-year-old. So, I live in a world that isn't designed for me. And then on top of that, I was born into a big South Asian community, and disability faces a further sense of stigma in ethnic minority communities. And, in some parts of the world, and, especially in the UK, I think we've got a really long way to go with the perception of disability. So, my upbringing was sort of layer upon layer upon layer of stigma, not only within my own community, but then also in society as well. So I've faced several challenges. By the age of 14, I'd broken my legs 6 times, and throughout the course of, I think, especially my younger days, I didn't know what I wanted to do. No one really encouraged me to say, yeah, you can go to uni, or this is a career option you could think about. My childhood was mainly spent on focusing on trying not to break any bones. So yeah, and as a result of that, I went to a special needs school. So I think my childhood was a very interesting one, to say the least.
And you talked about how your parents, in a conversation we had earlier, about how your parents treated you exactly like all the other children, and that really did help to sort of shape your resiliency and just getting on with it. It's like you just see yourself as everybody else, as anybody else.
Absolutely. And growing up in my surroundings, I was the only one who had this condition, and I didn't see myself as someone who was 3'10". I just saw myself as how I saw other people, and especially growing up, my parents, they never treated me differently from my siblings, and I would spend months of recovery after broken leg after broken leg. I'd often months be in plaster for a long time, and my mum would still be like, you're not getting away with the chores, you still need to do this, you still need to do that. And I'm so thankful and grateful for them instilling this kind of attitude in me, because then I would have just gone into the world thinking that, I would have been given special treatment at every single point, when actually life is much harder when not only you look different, but you need to access things in a different way. So yeah, I think a lot in my childhood has really set me up for resilience and success now.
Thank you. You've been an incredibly powerful role model, and really talking of role models, Dominic, as you said yourself, the public really took the Invictus Games to their heart. How much did having Prince Harry as a patron and an ally help in promoting the cause of the disabled, albeit through the lens of the wounded and injured service personnel?
I think it was absolutely vital, and you've got to remember, there wasn't just having him to help promote it. It was his idea. His idea was to bring the Invictus Game, or to create the Invictus Game, on a model that he'd seen in America, but to make it international, and to involve the friends and family, both of which were crucial things. So he was very, very inspirational in making that happen. And the reason for that is that if you remember, he was in Afghanistan. He did 2 tours out there as a soldier, as an officer, and had to come back when the press blew his cover. He came back on a transport aircraft on his own, in the company of the body of a Danish soldier, which was being repatriated, and 3 British soldiers who were in induced coma, wrapped in plastic with tubes coming in and out of them, in the dark, through the night, on his own with these people. And it had a profound effect on him. And he tells the story very movingly. And he decided he wanted to do something about the people who were coming back broken by the war. And he put this all in train. So it was absolutely of him. It was his idea. It was his passion and his commitment. And that passion and commitment remains undimmed. So, even though he's not in the UK anymore, that's still very much there. He's still very much a part of us. But having his profile at that time was invaluable. Of course it was. It just made people sit up and take notice. And I think one of the great things that we managed to achieve was a recalibration of people's attitudes towards disability. We certainly had an impact in this country. We certainly had a lot of disabled people coming to us saying, I've been disabled all my life, and I didn't realize that actually having a go in this incredible way was a possibility, and now I'm living my life slightly differently. So that was an amazing effect. But you've got to remember, we're international too. So if you look, for example, at Georgia, one of our participating nations, the attitude to disability in Georgia fundamentally shifted on the success of their sitting volleyball team. It sounds like an extraordinary story, but it's true. They ended up with a victorious medal-winning sitting volleyball team, and it changed the way the public regarded disability. So we've been trying to do that. We've been trying to show that you can overcome, you can do these things, and our cohort are an interesting group of people, because most of them were trained both physically and mentally to a very high degree before they had their injury. So they're equipped with lots of extraordinary tools to help them get over it. But in some cases, they've got a heck of a lot to get over. That their recovery pathway is long. It's lifelong, isn't it? It's all about continuous recovery. One of the guys said to me, one of our trustees who captained the UK team, said to me recently, said, I used to think I'd recovered, but I haven't. I'm in recovery, and I'll always be in recovery. And to Shani's point, it's challenging, it's hard work, but I think there are some fantastic role models, certainly in our cohort, that demonstrate that you can do the most amazing things.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that for me that I love about the games is that this ability to focus on ability rather than disability, if you see what I mean. And I think that's really important, because I think very often when people think about disability, they think about what people can't do as opposed to what people can do. And I think that, that the Invictus Games has been able to really demonstrate that very visibly. Shani, look, role models and allies are incredibly critical to this. We've seen it with Prince Harry. We've seen it with the work you and both Dominic have been doing. I'd love to sort of explore a little. We started touching on it a little bit, that intersection of being both Asian as well as a woman, and then on top of all of that, you're also disabled. How have you used those 3 dimensions in a way to enable you to inspire across numerous dimensions of diversity? And what have been some of the challenges in that sort of triple dimension?
Sure. So yeah, it's almost a triple threat, isn't it? It's, you know, layer upon layer. But what it really gives me is a really unique perspective of the world, and what that means is I can offer such a diversity of thought that, you know, my colleagues and counterparts won't, because they're also really different as well, and they've had different experiences. And I am a huge advocate of intersectionality, and I think that the conversation of diversity is typically addressed in a singular approach that segregates identity. And whilst that's helpful in starting the diversity conversation, it's just far more complex than that. And it's why I think, you know, in 2020 I still feel underrepresented. And, you know, talking about the challenges, my reality is that, you know, as an Asian disabled woman, I can experience bias and discrimination in multiple ways as a consequence of my race, my ability, and gender, or as a combination of all three. And with each of these identities come their own nuances, stigmas, and expectations. And, you know, it's just a melting pot of all of that continuously. So, you know, if I'm being honest, half of my time is being spent trying to figure out, you know, why am I being treated in this way? Is it because of my race? Is it because of my gender? Or is it because someone is judging my ability? And just to bring that to life, just to give you a really quick example, you know, as a person of colour, I'm 3 times as likely to be unemployed, or if in work, I'm likely to be underpaid. As a disabled person, I'm twice as likely to be unemployed, or if in work, likely to be underpaid. And as a woman, I'm likely to earn less than my male colleagues. Now, putting all that together, it sounds so bleak. And this example relates to employment, you know, highlighting all the different gaps and privileges. But this example can be applied to a variety of life situations. And it's why starting from intersectionality with everything that we do is so important.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, according to the Harking Institute, 1 billion people worldwide are affected by disabilities and face unemployment rate of 80%. I mean, let's just think about that for a few seconds. 1 billion people. What a phenomenal waste of untapped talent. Dominic, I'd love to just move to you for a little bit to just explore the impact that the games had on you personally. We know that the general public took to it, but what did the impact of the games have on you? What did you learn about yourself and about the participants that you could perhaps share with our audience today that would help shift mindsets for leaders in business?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think if you do any big projects, and I've been very fortunate to do some really interesting stuff during my life, it does have an effect on you. I mean, a profound effect, and certainly with Invictus, it forced me to re-examine my attitude towards disability and to become comfortable with. I mean, you know, you've got to remember that I'm talking about a particular group of people who were wounded in war or injured in training, or in some cases who were diagnosed with sickness during their military service. But the disability element of it was something that I had to come to terms with and become comfortable with, and it's changed my attitude to disability to the people around me. There's no question of that. In terms of the cohort that we're talking about, our men and women, I mean, at one level, they're familiar. You know, they're men and women who've served in the military, as I once did, and so you have a commonality, you have an understanding, you have a kind of a language. But they've faced things that I will never face, that I have never faced, that most people should never have to face, both in terms of the physical injury that they've sustained, but also the mental component to that. So, you know, every physical injury has a mental dimension to it, a psychological dimension to it, and a social dimension to it. And that's something that we've learned a lot about. I think also there's a fascinating way in which this particular group of people were injured. The ones who were injured in Afghanistan and Iraq were subject to blast injury fundamentally. And that is something that we haven't seen really since the First World War in any real quantity. And we had lost the learning that we had achieved around that. And so what you now find is that science is beginning to understand more about blast injury. So these are men and women who have been, yes, they've lost limbs in many cases, some of them won't have done. Some of them might just be suffering from what we would call an invisible injury, but they will have had the effects of blast, and that has an effect on the physiology. And science has a lot of work to do around that. So there are all sorts of fascinating pieces of research and discovery to be made. And you've got a group of people there who are, fit and able and willing to subject themselves to if you like, to scrutiny, to not to experimentation, but as a research base. It's an opportunity that can't be lost, because what's learned from them, what they're suffering, will help everybody. It'll improve the human condition. It will help people who are disabled in other ways, because we will learn more about those impacts and effects and how it works. So part of what we do at the foundation is to try and promote research and to deal with ways in which we can talk about it, but also specifically ways in which organizations and scientists can look at different elements of it. And in a world where I think things are increasingly in silos, we can ask questions that maybe bring people together to look at interesting ways of approaching mental illness, for example. I mean, there's some very exciting cutting edge research now being done around inflammation and mental illness and the extent to which it's physiological as opposed to psychological. There's an extraordinary amount that's being learnt about the mechanics of the body when once you lose a limb and how that impacts you. I mean, it's endless, and it's very valuable work, and we're in a very privileged position to be able to influence that. And I hope, I hope very much today you've got organisations listening into this who are interested in the possibilities in that, because we are, very keen to find partners who can help us deliver on what we're doing, because we're doing some very interesting, very exciting work, but we're under-resourced, and we desperately need, corporate partners and philanthropic partners to be able to help us deliver what we can do, not only for the benefit of these men and women who've served and given a huge amount, but also for the good of all of us, because we can all learn and we can all benefit.
Thank you. Well, there's a call to action there. So thank you. Shani, I know nothing's got in your way. Nobody's limited your ambitions or your aspirations, and you've achieved an incredible amount despite the odds. I know I come across so many people with disabilities just knocking it out the park every single day, despite the fact that there are stereotypes, misinformation and bias which prevents them from achieving their full potential. What do you think it will take to change perceptions across across to enable talented disabled individuals to fulfill their full potential across across organisations?
So there's a few things that I wanted to highlight, and they're really easy. And the first is everybody getting comfortable and understanding what disability actually is. So, I'm not disabled by the condition that I was born with. I'm only disabled when I experience barriers or bias. And I also think that we need to, not get hung up on definitions so much. It is literally, the barriers and bias that people face in society that actually causes disablement. I also think that as a society, we don't understand the prevalence. Here in the UK, 8 out of 10 people acquire their disability during their lifetime in work. Now, if businesses knew this, they would understand that this is going to affect their employees, and that this will affect their customers too, and that they, would already be designing products in a more universally and accessible way for everybody, because we know that when you design things for disabled people, it's suitable for the whole majority of society in general. And I also think that we need to understand that today in 2020, we have the solutions to make life more equitable for disabled people. It's not as hard as people think, but what stops us is our fear of making mistakes, our fear of offending people. We're not even confident to have conversations about disability. So what I would urge is to everyone to get to grips with that. And as Dominic said, get uncomfortable, with it, and you'll learn. You'll see that it's just not a big thing. It's not a them and us situation.
Thank you. Appreciate you saying that. Look, we're slowly coming to the end of our segment, and I could continue talking to you both for the rest of the afternoon. but you have a platform right now, and you're speaking to business people. What would you like to leave them with that will inspire them to address disabled representation across industry?
From my point of view, I absolutely agree with what Shani just said. I would say to them, this isn't about, we've got to try and find jobs for these poor people. Certainly speaking about micro, what is, you really want to get on the front foot and have one of these guys working for you, because they're in short supply and you're going to miss out if you don't have one. If you have got somebody who's decided to have an elective amputation of their leg because it wasn't working the way they wanted it to, and it means that they can run faster with a prosthetic, that's a kind of determination and attitude, and that brings a very powerful mindset to the workplace. You might want to hook into some of that. There are a fantastic group of people out there who have an awful lot to offer and to give, and it's not a question of feeling sorry for them, filling the gaps, doing it because you should. It's because they're extraordinary people, and you want extraordinary people working for you.
Thank you, Shani.
And just to echo that, the business case for diversity, inclusion, belonging in the workplace is so overwhelming, but it's also crucial to business recovery, especially, in this time that we're experiencing because of the pandemic. And most businesses will agree that building a pipeline of sustainable talent is vital. However, it's really hard to find the people with the right skills to boost growth. So do consider the untapped pool of talent that everyone has been overlooking, that is disabled people. We are so resilient, we're talented. I think that if I wasn't 3'10", I wouldn't be a great event manager or problem solver. It is my superpower almost. So just as Dominic said, look into that talent pool. There's so many of us, and it's going to keep growing and growing.
Thank you. And we are slowly and very quickly running out of time. I want to thank both my guests today, Shani Dada and Dominic Reed. It's been a phenomenal conversation, and I thank you deeply.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm Scarlett Fu of Bloomberg Television. We turn our equality spotlight now to Jim Fitterling, who walks the talk in embracing social change as CEO of Dow Inc. Jim, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Scarlett. Thank you for having me.
Now, the pandemic and our national reckoning with race has put economic inequality, health inequality, and racial injustice into stark relief. I wonder if you could start us off by giving us a brief overview of Dow's response to these systemic problems and how quickly you've been able to implement all these changes.
Yes, it's been quite a year, and I think we started with the pandemic and the pandemic response, which challenged everybody in our team globally. And then quickly on top of that, we had issues of racial injustice, which caught everybody's attention. And here at a time where everybody was pulling together to try to fight the virus and try to make sure we maintained a healthy workplace and try to keep things running, at the same time we were watching on TV some really incredible events. The murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then, of course, the George Floyd incidents. And, I was, at my age, I was thrown back into what it felt like in the late 60s and some of the unrest that we saw during that time. And it was a very stark time. And so we spent, as a team, a lot of time listening to our people and about their experiences, not just their experiences at work, but their experiences in everyday life and some of the injustices that they saw. And we said, look, we have to take action, just like we've taken action on the pandemic and how we're going to operate our business. We've got to take action on racial issues and on racial justice. And so we stepped up and we put together a program called Dow Acts. Dow Acts stands for advocacy, community, and talent, and we felt like we needed to do all three of those things. Our experience in leading on issues like gender parity and opportunities for women, leading on LGBTQ rights, and the work that we did on advocacy there, we said, look, we have to step in and on behalf of our employees, take a stand and help create the opportunities for advancement and address just the big disparities that they have in their lives versus what we have in our lives.
Now, one thing Dow also did is you're a founding member of the Board of Diversity Action Alliance, which has a concrete target of increasing the number of Black directors to at least one, disclosing the race and ethnicities of directors on the boards, and reporting on D&I measures on an annual basis. Is this a quota, and is there a specific timeline for achieving all of this?
It's an intention. We want our board to be representative of the world around us, and we want it to be representative of what we want to try to achieve as a company. And so if you look at our board, we're fortunate we're in the top quartile of all corporate boards in terms of diversity, whether it's race, whether it's gender, and all races. We have 3 African-American directors on our board right now. And we have had representation for quite some time. So it was very normal for us to step up to that. We also have similar targets for representation in my leadership team, in our people leaders, and within our corporation. And if people would go out to Dow.com and take a look at our latest sustainability report, it's called a sustainability report, but honestly, you might as well call it an ESG report because it's got everything in there, including tremendous detail on race, pay equity, gender pay gap, which there is none, but it's out there for everybody to see, so there's nothing to hide. But that doesn't solve the issues that we saw in graphic relief, and so what we need to do is we need to step up. And in Dow Acts, we committed some dollars. We've always been big supporters of historically Black colleges and universities, and we hire from there to bring talent into the organization. So we increased our efforts there, both in contributions and in hiring, and we committed another $5 million to help racial equality and social justice. On our advocacy pillar, we put in place a social justice council inside the organization, and that council is really to help us deal with racial injustices that occur. We have an organization where we have the capability for ethics and compliance hotline inside the company, but maybe sometimes issues of race wouldn't always make it through that kind of a hotline. So we wanted a council that represents the population of our people to step up and say, hey, we've got some things that aren't happening the way we want them to, and we need to address that change. And then we're a product of small communities. We have been since our founding here in Midland, Michigan. It's not a very large community, 42,000 people. If you go around the Dow world, we're in a lot of smaller towns, and so we have an outsized influence on what happens in those communities. And I would have to say, because Dow is an international company, a lot of those small communities may be more progressive than people believe, but these communities make a big difference in how people get treated, both in creating opportunities, but also how they might get treated just from policing and police reforms and other things that need to happen inside the communities. So we looked at all of those things and are making a concerted effort to try to make things better, to try to create more opportunities for advancement, and try to create more opportunities even beyond HBCUs into skilled trades and bringing people into the workforce in that way.
It's pretty clear from what you described that you've embraced this idea that a company's mission, it goes beyond shareholder primacy, but to all the stakeholders, to not just shareholders, but customers, suppliers, your employees, and your community. I mean, bottom line, how can a chemical company like Dow, through your products, promote diversity and equality? You talked a lot about what you do for your employees and for your community, but what about the products that you sell? How do you promote diversity in that way?
Well, we're an innovation house at the end of the day. So when you look at our customers, they're brand owners, and they come to us for all kinds of innovations in their formulations and their products. So I'll give you a real simple example, might be hair care products. We make a lot of materials that go into hair care formulations, shampoos, conditioners, treatments. And so when you get into our organization, we have within our organization the capability to talk to populations of people about their challenges with some of those brands. So, for example, our African Heritage ERG, we have actually worked with them on skincare and hair care products to try to address some of the issues that they face when they go to the supermarket. A lot of brands are not tailored for them. And we know this because for many years we've dealt with the Brazilian market, which has its own unique features and needs for their style of hair and their hair care challenges. And so we're able to weave what we do in the ERGs into what we do with the business strategy and how we interact with our brand owners and their teams that actually formulate and test those products. Same with Procter & Gamble when it comes to making razors that have to work with African American skin. Those have some unique challenges, and they need something different than I might need for shaving on a daily basis. That's one example of how we would face those kinds of market challenges.
Let's go back to that idea of employee resource groups, the ERGs, because they obviously play a big role in what you do and how you come up with your products and how you tailor your products for your customers. To me, ERGs are often something that is kind of a social network within a company. They host after-hours drinks. They host programming events tailored at specific audiences. Clearly, you've turned ERGs at Dow into something more active. How would you suggest other companies turn ERGs from something passive into an active force with a seat at the table that feels empowered to speak up?
I think like a lot of companies, ERGs started the way you described, but then they evolved. They evolved into discussions about career development and how do you progress within the company and what are some of the challenges that you face and how do you develop a mentor relationship. And then they work their way into how can we be part of the innovation platform? So how do we work with research to maybe innovate products for our own ethnicity and help to make that better? They also can break down barriers. So we have an ERG called the Middle Eastern Intercultural Network, which we created some years ago when we were making investments in the Middle East and joint ventures there. And you can imagine after 9/11, what the sensitivities were here around the Muslim population. And yet we have a very large Muslim population that works in Dow. So that ERG helped us to talk about, what is Muslim culture really about? And what is that life really about? And not the extreme things that we saw, but the day-to-day life, and break down some of those barriers and make them feel more comfortable. And at the height of our investment in Sadara, we trained 1,000 Saudi engineers at our locations all around the world without an incident. And I would say not only without an incident, but it was just it brought a lot to the organization in terms of their ability at a working level to actually feel what it's like to live somebody's life. And that's what we're trying to do today with the ERGs, is make it all about the experience, a sense of inclusion, a sense of belonging, a sense of pride, and also the opportunity to get that same chance for advancement as everyone else.
Well, speaking of advancement, you started working at Dow in the mid-'80s. You are what's considered a lifer at the company. So you've seen some incredible cultural changes in the country and in your industry. So I want to get your thoughts on the role of the CEO, especially in 2020. It's changed so much. There's now this expectation that a CEO needs to be publicly outspoken and leading when it comes to social issues. And this has now almost become part of the job. I wonder, how much time do you spend on cultural, social issues versus making and selling chemicals? Would you say it's 50-50? Is it 80-20?
It's a balanced scorecard today. I mean, you have to deliver financial results. And so nowhere along the way did we say that we weren't going to deliver financial results, but we also are expected to deliver in a lot of other areas too, like sustainability, like human rights, and like dealing with some of the issues we saw from racial justice standpoint. And it's interesting that, some of my counterparts would say that business is a catalyst for positive change. I believe that. I think that's what we've been trying to do, either through the Business Roundtable statement that was signed over a year ago. That was never meant to be exclusive. We're shifting away from profits to focus on all these other things. We know that we need to do both. but we have to set the tone. And, big business, just like government, has to set the tone for the change that we want to see in the world, and we have to create the environment that we want for our people. And that means we have to transcend the company into the communities where we operate. And we have to respond to those demands. And those consumer demands, in many cases, are also social demands that we have to deal with. So whether it's sustainability and what impact that has on our products, which ultimately has an impact on the cost of the products to the consumer, that comes right back to returns to the shareholders. We've got to look at all that. And I'd say that's the biggest change to me. Is it used to be very heavily and almost solely a financial return, where if you were making the financial results, everything else would solve itself.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody looks at it that way anymore. And I certainly don't. I said before, I spend as much as 25% of my time on sustainability. This year, if you look at pandemic, flood relief, hurricane relief, relief from incidents that are kind of outside the control of business, and work on racial injustice and equality, it's a very balanced scorecard where I spend that time.
Does it frustrate you, Jim, that acknowledging racial inequality has become politicized and the federal government kind of drops the ball on it and is so divided that it doesn't really want to address it, leading the private sector to lead the way on this front?
It doesn't frustrate me as much as some of the atrocities that you see on social media or on television. I mean, we've missed the boat somewhere in terms of how we treat people. We've just forgotten what civil society is all about, and it requires all of us working together to move society into a better place. And this polarization, I mean, just look at where we are with COVID today. We've politicized something as simple as wearing a mask, or whether you should get a vaccine when there's a vaccine treatment. We've made that so political that now nobody knows how to sort out the scientific from the political. And that's not a good situation for us to be in. And it's not just the United States. We're seeing this all over the world. If there's any silver lining to the pandemic, it should be to cause us to take a little bit of a time out and reassess our priorities and how we want to move forward, government and business. And there's no reason we can't do this together. We don't have to be at odds with each other to make the world better.
You broke new ground, Jim, as an openly gay CEO in the manufacturing industry. How do you think it filters through to how you think about diversity, how you think about racial injustice, how you think about sustainability, or any of the issues that you're confronted with?
When I decided to come out, and I made a conscious decision to live most of my life in the closet corporately, because I had made an interpretation in my own head about the risk reward of coming out. And, you create fears in your own mind about how you'll be viewed or how you'll be accepted by coming out. As I look back on it now after coming out, I've had nothing short of overwhelming positive support, very, very little negative from coming out from all corners of the world. And I would say, I think when we embrace something like sustainability, where we're trying to tackle climate change, carbon neutrality, cleaning up plastic waste, stopping the waste, making a more circular economy. A lot of times when we approach those type of topics, we look at it with some fear of the unknown, instead of embracing that it's something that needs to be done and figure out how to make it happen. And so I think going through that in my own personal situation gave me a different perspective on life. I'm also a stage 4 cancer survivor, so none of this seems as much life and death as that. And so that gives me a little bit different perspective as well. And I think those two things together really have made the difference. As business leaders,
interesting.
One of our
I was going to say it's interesting that lends to fearlessness on your part. Go on, please.
Yeah, it's not complete fearlessness, right? I mean, but it's a different perspective. You just have a different perspective after you've gone through that, and things are not as bad as they seem. And you understand that when you're dealing with cancer, it is what it is, right? You don't know, you've got it, you don't know why you got it, you don't know what the cause was, but it is what it is, and you've got to come up with a game plan to deal with it. That's where we are with sustainability. That's where we are with the virus and the pandemic. That's where we are with racial injustice, and that's where we are with equality. This is what it is. It isn't nice. We have seen some pretty ugly things this year, but we have to deal with them. Nobody else is going to deal with it. You've got to take ownership of it, and you've got to deal with it, and we've got to take action. So one of the things that we try to do here is it isn't about talk, it's about action. We've got to turn this into actions that we can take. As an employer, one of the most important things that we do every day for our people is make sure that we have a safe environment for them to come to work. When we get into equality, and we were going through this with LGBT marriage equality, one of the things that I took from Kenji Yoshino, who's a legal scholar in New York at NYU, on marriage equality was you really have to treat the workplace a little bit like an embassy. You may be working in a country where being gay is not accepted at all. But if you've got an employee that's gay coming to work every day in your place of work, you want them to be safe regardless of what's going on outside. You don't want to create a problem for them in their country, but at work, you want them to be safe. So in that way, you treat the company a little bit like an embassy. And we have to be that way when it comes to stakeholder capitalism. We have to treat our communities, we have to treat our customers, we have to treat our employees the way that we want to be treated. And that means that we have to get out in front and set the example and set the tone for everyone else to follow. And if we do that, business can be a cause for
good. In the
good
meantime, Jim, I want to get your thoughts
change.
on the working from home and return to office debate. Some degree of work from home will likely be permanent. Do you see a link between remote work and a commitment to diversity? Because some people say remote work can boost diversity because it broadens the talent pool to include those with medical conditions, stay-at-home parents, seniors, while the counter argument is that it's hard for someone who's underrepresented to be visible in a remote work kind of setup. Distance reinforces people's tendency to want to take shortcuts and favor people who think like them or look like them. What's your take on all of this?
I'm tremendously positively surprised by just how well we've done moving to work from home. I mean, we've had 2/3 of our workforce working from home for most of the year, and it's been seamless. And if anything, we've gotten closer to our customers. We've done a better job of servicing them. Yet we've got 1/3 of our population that goes into the plant every day that makes sure the product keeps moving. And they're continuing to get their job done. I don't know. I think part of that is going to exist for a long time. So I think we're going to have more flexibility and more work-life balance from that than we've ever had. I'm not sure that we can stay that way forever. I don't think we can stay 100% work from home forever. I think it's difficult to transmit culture when you're working from home. So if you look at my population today, 40% of my workforce is less than 5 years with the company. Now, if you stop everything and say everybody go work from home and keep the company running, and your employee base has 20 years of experience, that's easy to do because culturally they're already in the culture and they know what's going on and they know how to do it. But if you've got a lot of new employees coming in and you're trying to build culture and transmit culture, that's a little bit tougher to do, I think, remotely. And so you're going to have a combination of in the office and remote. We haven't really gotten into the point of how that's all going to work as we move forward because we've had fits and starts with cases in different locations around the world. But I think we're going to find a balance as a company where we're doing both. And I do think the positive is we've allowed more flexibility for people. People have been very productive. They have worked hard. And they've delivered great results through all this. And we've done some things that none of us would have imagined we'd be able to do working remotely. And, kudos to all of our technology providers that make it possible because we've used every ounce of it to keep ourselves going strong through all this.
Jim Fitterling, I want to thank you for your time and for sharing some of your thoughts here as we wrap things up. Jim Fitterling is the CEO of Dow Inc. I also want to share my appreciation for all of our speakers and for Bank of America, which is supporting this session within today's virtual event. And of course, to our audience, I want to thank you for tuning in. Please engage with us by using the hashtag, the Bloomberg Equality hashtag on social media. We will try replying to you. Meantime, in the next hour of the Bloomberg Equality Summit, we will be focusing on diversity at the C-suite and at the board level.